Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of the One Hood Power Hour. As always, I'm Ryan White here with Miracle Jones. We may also be joined by our director Kahari Mosley shortly as well. Um, yeah, and so as always, we got a great lineup of guests for you here today. But we're going to kick it off. Just talk a little bit about some local and national news headlines. Things that have been going on in the past week since our last episode. I still feel kind of out of the loop after the holidays and everything, but there's definitely still, a few big things to touch on. First and foremost, on the national level, obviously, is the Georgia Senate elections are tomorrow, which is, obviously a huge, very consequential election, long-ranging consequences for the next few years at least. So that'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. Polls are open until I believe 7 p.m. tomorrow. People are still able to bring in and drop off any ballots that they got via mail or any other way early. We're really encouraging people to come out for that election. That's obviously a really big deal down there. Also related to Georgia, we heard over the weekend was President Trump's phone call with the Georgia Secretary of State, which was, troubling to say the least, but not at all surprising. I really don't think I've ever seen anybody double down on anything as much as he has in regards to this election. I would say I'm almost impressed by it if it wasn't, for such malicious purposes. But yeah, so there was part of that recording of the phone call has been released, where he's basically just, prompting the Secretary of State to find whatever that means, the necessary number of votes to overturn the election. But back on the local level around Pittsburgh, there have been some news stories as well. Another thing over the weekend, there were a couple explosions that there's not a ton of information on that yet. It doesn't seem that anybody was hurt, which is good. But apparently they're looking for a white pickup truck that had the explosions had come from somebody in that truck allegedly. So that's I don't really have a lot more information on there, nor does anybody publicly. But that was a weird, unexpected development, which hopefully doesn't escalate any further than that. And then one other thing I wanted to touch on before I pass it off to Miracle, if she's still with us right now, is that, and this isn't particularly surprising either, but once again, the Pittsburgh public schools have delayed, the reopening of their in-person instruction, which again, I don't think is particularly surprising to anybody given the, expected holiday surges of COVID cases. But there was still the possibility that would be reopening on January 4th, and I believe that's been delayed to the earliest date that they'll be having in-person instruction in Pittsburgh public schools is now the 27th of this month. But again, we'll have to play it by ear and see how things are even towards then at the end of the month.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a very stressful time for parents as they trying to figure out, what the next steps are. But the delaying of schools comes amidst this idea that there's going to be a very unprecedented surge of COVID-19, not just the strains that we've already had, but this new highly contagious strain that's been found in places like New York and Oregon. And so now people really don't know what to expect. But going back to these explosions, we also need to bring up what happened in Tennessee on Christmas Day and how there was a literal bombing of an American city by an individual who believed that 5G was one of the causes and reasons of COVID-19. And we need to have a high alert right now that people are literally out here making incendiary devices to cause chaos and disruption in our communities and neighborhoods. So we're literally looking at living at a time of increase in domestic terrorism that no one is really calling it domestic terrorism, but these bombings that are going on. And in addition to what's happening right now here in Georgia with the election and, and Trump pleading to find those 11,000 votes, that happened, that's a few years ago. That's why Stacey Abrams ended up losing her gubernatorial run, is they literally purged hundreds of thousands of voters, and they found ways to discount votes. So for Georgians, hearing that phone call is just a reminder why people are working so very hard to protect the vote and have a free and fair election, because a lot of these votes, predominantly the Black votes, are being thrown out here in Georgia and South Carolina and places like Michigan. All of these voter investigations are in places where Black people are voting. And that's one of the reasons why even here in Pennsylvania, a couple of legislatures have said that they are contesting this election and introducing bills that will make it harder for people to vote next cycle. So it's very important that we put in the context this voter suppression, not only historically, but what it can mean for elections coming up, because there's now going to be a wave of legislation to roll back a lot of voter protections because the Voting Rights Act has not been restored. And it's another reason why we're calling on Georgians who are registered to vote to make sure they show up tomorrow if they believe in electoral politics and vote in the Senate race for the Democratic ticket.
Yeah, most definitely. I appreciate you providing that context, especially as it pertains to Georgia, which at least in recent history has been one of the states that's had a lot of issues with voter suppression, legislatively and otherwise, and attempts to really suppress the vote in that manner. So it's really important that we stay vigilant of any attempts to do just that, again, to crack down on that. Additionally, that come out of the presidential election, this Senate election, etc., and really work diligently to prevent that from happening and to continue to roll back the voter suppression measures that are still in place. And also, thank you for bringing up the explosion in Nashville last week, and you used domestic terror, which is absolutely correct, and has been something that's really been just very underreported on. I heard very little about. I mean, I've seen information about it I've seen more information about it on Twitter than anywhere else, honestly. Just like pictures from the site, like the way the news initially reported on it. I did not guess at all that it was nearly as bad as the pictures that I saw on Twitter of it was an entire city block basically leveled. And I didn't really see anything in the initial reporting to indicate that at all. No messaging or characterization as any sort of terror attack. Thankfully, I don't believe anybody was killed in that other than potentially the person who organized the bombing. But, still an entire block was basically destroyed. Like, that's, call it what it is. That's absolutely domestic terrorism. And hopefully we don't continue to see
very important that people. Yeah, and it's also very important that on January 6th, I believe, is when the Electoral College votes and stuff are starting, and there are people who have been threatening violence starting tomorrow and into Wednesday and Thursday. And so I think it's just not a call to be alarmed, but a call to be cautious and prepared, and just to understand we're really entering into, I would say, for American politics, very contested and uncharted territories. I think for other people, in other countries, a lot of elections are usually the most violent times in their nation's history. And I think that this is something that may become a reality for many Americans if we really do not figure out a way to change the messaging about this election. It's just, I don't think we're really understanding the gravity of the situation that we find ourselves in. And it's going to be, very scary if people literally are going to take up arms. You've seen people storm, the capitals and places like in Oregon and different places, but we haven't seen that on a national scale. And if that's what's going to happen on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, then we really have to be prepared to protect our communities and each other from these domestic terrorists who are really trying to subvert our democracy because they don't like that one of their candidates did not get reelected.
Yeah,
We're joined
absolutely.
by Kahari.
Yeah.
Hey, what's up, y'all? How y'all doing? I'm actually broadcasting live from the Eastburg Avengers World Headquarters. As y'all know, I moonlight as a AAU baseball coach, and today was the first day of our off-season stuff. And no, we don't have like 20 kids in here. It's actually one at a time. We have a 3,000 square foot space, so we're pretty much following the same kind of protocols like the most stringent schools are. So I don't want anybody to get, think that we're doing something crazy over here, and we have to wear a mask on indoors. Actually, I'm the only one here right now. And by state law, I have to wear a mask. So that's why I got a mask on right now. But what's up, world? Yeah, now it's a very, interesting time, to make a quick segue from youth baseball, to the Georgia election. And I've been following very closely, the phone call with the Secretary of State. And as Miracle said, I think that a lot of folks are under a false impression if, on Wednesday after the Electoral College, is certified, that, all this just kind of goes away. You know what I mean? I think this is something that, we're going to be dealing with for, potentially decades. Kind of just the misinformation and the impact, of, this political moment that we're in, and how, potentially destructive it really can be, to democracy, overall. So it's a really, really dangerous time, and I think a lot of people aren't, really, appreciating, how dangerous this time is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said, if this sets any sort of precedent for future election cycles, or anything along those lines, yeah, then not only is it not over for this election cycle, but this could be a trend that continues to plague our democracy for cycles and cycles and decades and decades. Yeah, so I think that's a really important point to make as well. But yeah, on that note, I think we're ready to shift on to our first guest. We have Jay-luh. We have Jala Rucker from the Pittsburgh Union of Regional Renters here to talk about eviction moratoriums, about rental assistance, and about a lot of the issues and misconceptions and data and updates surrounding all of that. Yeah, so Jayla, if you just wanted to start off by talking about in Pennsylvania, what the current status of these different moratoriums and CDC partial bans on evictions and restrictions and everything like that. If you could just talk about what the current state of all that is, real quick.
So the status of the moratorium, it'll actually expire on the 31st of this month. And we are fighting to actually by next week to get that status put back into place, because if not, then the death rate mortality, of course, rise. But I think what the status is people believe that it automatically applies to the tenants, but tenants have to assert protection for themselves. And that goes by certain things as like the declaration form. If tenants need support with finding help for evictions. So I just believe that tenants automatically think that the moratorium is just automatically in place and that they can't be evicted out of their home.
So, yeah, so that's a really important point. Thank you. You mentioned that there's steps that tenants have to take in order to stave off any potential eviction. You mentioned the declaration form and getting that filled out and everything. But are there other steps necessary for tenants to take? Other resources that they can be connected with? Things
There
that
are other resources they can connect to. Rent Help PGH. I think that we had you put the hyperlink to that in the chat box there, to Rent Help PGH, and they can also reach out to PURR. And by them doing so, we can send out referrals to other partners that we collaborate with in order to get them the assistance that they need.
And then,
no, go ahead, Miracle.
can you just I know you were talking about, we don't want to have an increase in the mortality rate due to COVID-19, but can you just share some data about what's going on with evictions in Pennsylvania and Allegheny County, and what PURR is doing to help keep people in their homes?
So right now, there is about 469 eviction hearings currently scheduled for next week if nothing changes. So we're hoping that Judge Kim Clark doesn't postpone next week's hearing. If so, an estimate of about maybe 8 people would likely die as a result of the evictions.
So, just to clarify, are all of those hearings, are those like in-person hearings where people would have to come to the courthouse?
Those are in-person hearings. People need to show up at their court hearings. Don't just not come to the court hearings because you feel like you filled out the declaration form and you got it to your landlord. And there are certain steps that you can take by getting that declaration form to your landlord, such as certified mail, taking a photo of it. When you're putting it in a drop box, you can hand deliver it to them at the court proceedings when you come to your court hearing. There's also like a USPS certified mailing form that you can fill out. And I think that Jacob put the hyperlinks to all of those forms and the chat box.
Awesome. Thank you for providing that information. And so you said, and correct me if I'm getting this number wrong, but I believe you just said if all of these eviction hearings are to proceed as scheduled, that would you estimated about 8 deaths would come as a result of this. Are you attributing that to people? Are those like COVID related deaths you're talking about?
COVID related.
Okay.
Everything that I'm speaking about is COVID related.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify. And so when you say 8 deaths, is that like 8 deaths as a result of people, no longer being housed and so they're exposed in public, or is that also including, people being at risk of being exposed at these hearings? Because I would believe that these hearings would quite possibly turn into like super spreader events, and there would be even further risk of people being exposed at the time. So that that would be another way that this is really presents a public health danger to people.
So I would say that estimate would be like overall.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that.
And I know that y'all send out information that I think and one of the reasons why y'all wanted to come on is because there was a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about what the moratoriums were. People not realizing that they had to assert that as defense. It wasn't just a blanket protection. And I believe y'all were sending out information today that there are hundreds of landlords who have, well, there's landlords who have filed what amounts to hundreds of evictions within the county. So what are some of the things that volunteers with your organization would be helping doing to keep people in their homes?
So volunteers from the organization, they would more than likely like come to the magistrate district hearings located around the city and the different boroughs, and they would pass out information such as the declaration form. They would do trainings beforehand so they would know exactly what they need to say if people had questions about the information that we are informing them about. So um, you can also do things like have tenants do word of mouth, just talk about their experiences and what they learned and what worked for them and share that with their neighbors. Also, we can have tenants contact their state reps, their councilmen, their PA legislators. Um, and those are the kind of things that we need tenants to do to support us, to make sure that we get this out there.
And so, yeah, in addition to providing updates about, the moratoriums and just restrictions on evictions, can you talk a little bit about any updates around funding for rental assistance programs recently, whether that be like federal or state level or?
So we do know that there is a second round of funding coming out. We just don't know exactly when that'll be, but there is a second round of funding coming out, and there's also a host of other resources that tenants could apply to if they need rental assistance. And that is, they can call 211. That's the 211 number. And they could get into a chat room. 211 is experienced in, asking you for your zip code and locating exactly where you are to give you information about organizations and local to you and your community that can help assist you. And they do things like send them to you in a text message, or they can email them to you as well. Um, there is the URA eviction prevention program. And also, again, remember, you could always refer them to Rent Help PGH, and we can send out that referral for that tenant to get them the assistance that they need. And everything doesn't always surround rent. And that's one thing I like to stress to people. Everything is not always surrounded to rent right now. We're in a pandemic, and it's not just about your rent, because I'm a family and I had of 6. If I can't feed my kids, how am I pay my rent? And we have a lot of single mothers right now that's struggling and striving, because now we're not just moms, we're teachers. We're teaching our kids because there's no instruction at school where the kids can go in person. We're getting the instructions at home. And a lot of these things that we're having to adapt to now that we're not used to, So it's just a lot of things that people are facing, and it brings on a lot of anxiety. The food insecurities, the lack of transportation, the childcare, and healthcare is one of our biggest issues. So when the pandemic first started, there was no way that I can get my kids in to get their updated immunization shots. You can't see the dentist. It's like you got to be tested for COVID, or have you had a fever, or any of these things before you can see the doctor, when every underlying issue is not, let me say, in reference to COVID. Just because I got a headache or a cough doesn't mean that I have COVID. So it's just a lot of underlying issues outside of rent. And once again, like I said, PURR, we're always out there on the ground. Me and Jacob, for me, I'm one of them people. I'm going out. I'm actually exposing myself daily. I have not stopped working since this pandemic started, and long before it started, I never stopped working. I've been grassroots out here for years, but as of right now, I've been risking myself and my family. I go out, I pick up food boxes, I take them to families' homes. I do the grab and go meals, because like I said, once again, it's a lack of transportation. We got families that's stuck in the house with food insecurities. They can't get out. Food banks is closed down. The lack of resources, the information is not getting out there, and that's the support that we're failing to realize that people still need. Because shelter is just not our biggest issue here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I appreciate you making that point. In addition to all the work you do, but thank you for talking about how really the issue with rent and housing, major issue, but it's only one branch of all these different issues surrounding fundamental human needs that are all really important and have all been really greatly exacerbated by the effects of the pandemic. And as a result are being thrown into the spotlight, and rightly so. So thank you for highlighting all of that as well. So just one final quick question for anybody who wants to help out with you and PURR, and providing any of these resources and doing any of this work. What's the best way for them to get involved with you or just support you in any way?
They can reach out to PURR. Our hyperlink should be in the chat box. Our Gmail, also our contact phone number. They can reach out and contact myself or Jacob. More than likely, Jacob would be the one to respond to them. And then we can take the steps from there on how they can actually support us and help support themselves and their family and their neighbors that's surrounding them and just the community as a whole.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate you coming on with us tonight. And on that note, I think we're going to bring in our second guest, Soraya Bey, who's been a vocal advocate for traffic calming improvements and other infrastructure changes on Maytide Street in her neighborhood, Carrick. So we're going to bring her in right now to talk about that.
Hello. Hi. So I think just to get right to it, like what is going on on Maytide Street? Because, for our viewers, I'm friends with you on social media, and I feel like every other month or every other week I log in and I see you talking about either you got hit or a neighbor got hit or there's been some type of very dangerous situation. So what is actually going on your street?
To make a long story short, the road's very dangerous. It's a narrow, windy road. Um, when I first moved here, it wasn't as big of an issue, at least in my experience anyway. At the time, too, I was working full time, so I wasn't home as many hours of the day as I have been with COVID to really recognize how often these things were happening. And so, because people speed, and there was really no enforcement to slow motorists down, there were continuous situations where people were speeding and then crashing. Most of the time it was speed. A lot of times it had to do with drunk drivers or them being under the influence of an abuse of a substance of some sort. And so it's caused a lot of headache for residents, pedestrians, everything. It's just been super crazy.
And so what are some of the steps that you have personally been taking to essentially ensure that you and your neighbors are safe when you park and when you travel back and forth?
So in March of last year, wow, we're in a new year. So March of 2020, I randomly reached out to my council person's office to kind of find out what we could do about traffic calming measures. They had sent me some information, you have to get a petition in order for them to kind of do an assessment to see what they can do. Well, at the time that they had given me that information, it was when we were, shut down. So I didn't feel comfortable going door to door for a petition. So I reached out to them and asked them, is there any way that I could set up an electronic petition of some sort to get maybe little mailers and just drop them in my neighbors' mailboxes? That way they could log in, they could sign a petition, and we didn't have to worry about, exposure to COVID, right? So it was weeks of me emailing them to ask, not so much it was more permission. Like I didn't want to go out of my way to do it and then they reject it. And then I also wanted to know, was there a specific format that they, preferred? Every time I reached out, they said they were looking into it. They said, it was on their radar. I was reaching out to my council person's office. I then got information for the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. I reached out to them too. It was a lot of back and forth. Again, I reached out in March. In May, my SUV was T-boned. So let's just clarify. There's no on-street parking on my street. You cannot park on the street. I have a driveway and a parking pad. My SUV was parked on my parking pad, off the street, off the sidewalk, and somehow an F-150 crashed for it. Came off the road, front of my neighbor's house, and T-boned my SUV into the neighbor's front steps. Like at 7:30 in the morning, everybody comes outside. I'm all like, okay, now I really have to buckle down and find out what I can do about doing more. Mind you, this was my second total vehicle parked in that same spot, and I think my third accident by this time. So I had my first SUV parked in the same spot, total by a drunk driver with a hit and run in December of 2018. That was a mess. But like I said, it was just kind of like he was drunk, it was like a one-off for me at that point. But then when it happened again in May of last year, I'm like, okay, we have to do something. So at this point, I didn't even recognize that I had about 40 photos in my phone from 2016 up until May of 2020 of car accidents on my street. And I remember like all of them vividly. So I just started notating everything, reached out to the council person's office. They basically, their first response was, they're looking into the electronic petition. Then they came back and said they canceled the petition on the other floors. We don't need it. So I guess with all of the data that I had, and I guess it had already been on their radar, they decided they waived the requirement for the petition. We didn't need that. At this point, they want to do it, but there's no funding. So they said that there was no funding in the 2020 budget for them to do it, but that the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure was still looking at things they could do so that they can figure out what it would cost to make sure that when the money comes available, they would have it ready to go. So this was in May. 28 days after my SUV was hit, my husband's SUV was hit. All the cars were parked. We were never in them. We're never moving. Like they're parked off the street. At this time, they crashed his SUV into our house. So now we have 2 total cars in 30 days and property damage to the front of our home. Mind you, 18 months prior, my SUV was totaled, parked. That accident was so bad that the driver hit my neighbor's SUV, my husband's car, knocked the telephone pole out of the ground into my SUV, and it went up in flames. So that was the first total for us. That was December of 2018. Then May of 2020, my SUV was pushed into the neighbor's steps. Then June of 2020, my husband's SUV was pushed in our house. And so at this point, like my wheels are set. I'm like, okay, I understand that you guys keep saying that there's no money until next year, but we can't wait until next year. We need money now. And so I start doing more research on my street. Mind you, I'm full disclosure. When I purchased this house, I was 22. So I was still really young. I just wasn't as involved. I wasn't paying attention. I was working full time. I was, so to speak, living my best life, right? I didn't spend a lot of time at home. So like I said, when I started doing all this research, just kind of looking at news articles, tracking all of the accidents that I had tracked that never made it to the news, police reports, insurance claims, some other things that I had found were that there had been pedestrians killed on my street by speeding drivers. So I'm like, okay, because my first thought was when I'm reaching out to the city, like, does somebody have to die before you guys do anything? But I started looking things up, and it turns out 3 people had already died on my street from people speeding. I was never able to really get any information about whatever happened to the driver who hit the one pedestrian. I do know in the second incident that I knew that people had passed away. There were 2 people in a car who passed away from the impact. There was 1 pedestrian and then 2 people in a vehicle. Like I said, when I was reaching out to the city, I started kind of making a lot of noise on social media. As Miracle can attest, she was my friend on social media. I would go live on Facebook. I would just prop my iPad up on the porch like 2 or 3 times a day for like 2 hours. I would prop it up on the porch and go live and just show the cars speeding up and down the street. It's a residential area. The speed limit is 25 miles per hour. They go at least 40 to 70. It's crazy. Residents can't safely get in and out of their cars. We can't safely pull into our driveways. And there was a lot of this communication I was having, with the councilman's office about what we can do. I had even invited the councilman and his chief of staff to kind of come to my house, sit on my porch, see things for themselves. They declined. Chief of staff basically said that, he's familiar with the area. He has a friend who lives on my street. But I thought that was very contradictory because they had also said to me in previous emails that they didn't know that Maytide was an issue until I started reaching out. Mind you, there were all of the deaths that happened way before, I had reached out for any resolution. Another thing was I felt like if he did have a friend that lived on our street, it wouldn't have taken for me, all the way at the bottom of the hill to start making outreach. His friend, who has friends in high places would have been like, hey, can I get some help over here, right? Especially since where he said his friend lived is one of the hot spots for accidents closer to the top of the hill. So this, like I said, was in June after my husband's SUV was hit. I started going around the city, looking at other streets and neighborhoods that they were putting speed bumps in, different signage, things like that, and reached out pictures, videos, like, why can't we get this? What can we do to get this? I understand it costs money, to get a construction team out here to do XYZ, but what can we do about putting up signage, police presence? I even gave them permission to set up a traffic detail with the city police on my property to do to slow them down. Because honestly, a lot of residents think that that's the only thing that's going to work. Is if this is a known trap area, it'll force people to slow down. Because honestly, because nobody's ever around and the response time for police presence in our area is pretty bad anyway, people know that they can get away with it. There have been several times that I've had to call 911 because people would race on our street, just up and down, and turn around. I don't know how familiar you guys are with my street, but if you are familiar with it, it's like, how are you doing that? And what would make you think that that would be, okay, right? So there was an incident where a friend, she's actually my cousin, she just made a casual post on Facebook about her council person, how much she loved this council person was great, all of these things. And I had just commented and was like, that's so great that your experience, because that hasn't been mine in my area. So the council person responds and goes, hey, who's your council person? I would hope that, they were doing more XYZ. So I told her, she goes, oh, well, he's not really good with email, or social media. He does better with email. And I'm like, well, I've been emailing for like 6 months already. You know what I mean? And she's just like, well, no. Send me your information. I'll have him get in touch with you. And I was like, okay. So she sent them my information. And a couple hours later, he called me. And when he called me, it was a very interesting conversation. He called and basically said that, I had made statements or comments that his office hadn't been in touch with me, but he was certain that they had, and he wanted to confirm that. And I was like, no, I've spoken to your staff, but I've never spoken to you. I've made several attempts to get a hold of you when I felt like nothing was, happening with your staff, and never once did I hear from you. I was even on WPXI, I think when my husband's car was hit in June, didn't hear from anybody. So the only reason why he reached out to me is because the other council person kind of was like, hey, you might want to look into this. So he arranged to come to my house finally. Like, he said, hey, I want to get out there. I want to take a look. And I was like, well, I invited your staff to let you know to come do that, 2 or 3 months ago at this point. He's like, no, it's fine. I'm going to come tomorrow. So the next day he came. He talked in circles to me. We kind of stood outside. We watched the cars. Now, when he pulled up, let me tell you about when we have company here. We have to go play musical cars when we have company here, okay? It's very dangerous. We have to make sure the cars are aligned a certain way. We have to make sure it's a clear passage for our guests to get in and out of their cars. I didn't do that with the council person on purpose. I kind of was like, I want him to get here and see what this is like, right? So me and my husband sat on the porch. And when he pulled over next to my neighbor's house, like in front of my neighbor's house. And I could tell he was kind of nervous. And he's itching out. And then he finally pulls up and he pulls over like in front of the other neighbor's driveway. So when he gets out the car, he looks at me. He's like, wow. And I was like, you don't say. So we go on and we're having a conversation and he's looking and he's like, yeah, like, this is kind of crazy. He's like, I feel so bad that you felt like, I wasn't very supportive of your efforts. And I was like, I haven't heard from you. I've been making contact for months and I have gotten nothing from you until now. And so he asked me about all of the things that I think would, be necessary. So we talked about the speeding, the accidents. We've also talked about some abandoned properties on the street, the inaccessible sidewalks from the overgrown hillside, from those properties and things like that. He basically said, to summarize, that obviously everything can't happen at one time. For me to draft an email or a list of all the things that I feel like need to be done, things that I have got from other community members to get him, we try to tackle the list. I'm like, I understand that. Based on the things that we discussed that day, he based the construction of it all. There's no money for construction, but in the meantime, we can do X, Y, Z. So what they had decided that they wanted to do for us was give us speed bumps, but there was no money. So we were asking, since there's no money for speed bumps, what about additional signage? There's barely speed limit signs up there. There's no arrow markings. There's no reflectors. There's no anything. You know what I mean? The street is windy and there's a stoplight, a traffic light at the bottom and top. But when you're approaching the traffic light at the bottom of the hill, there's a curve. That's another hot spot for accidents, because when people are flying down the hill, they can't see around the curve that there's cars stopped at the red light. With COVID, right after everything like kind of opened back up, I think it was in May or June, we would sit on the porch and watch all those accidents, like literally split seconds. And there were a few of them that actually, hit. And we sat there and we would help the person that got hit and get the information and, all that stuff. So I was able to track things that way. But like I said, there were a lot of things that were more than just speed bumps that I felt like they could do more to address. So we asked for signage, we asked for extra stop signs. What else we asked for? The sidewalk across the street from my house to be clear, to make accessible for pedestrians, because not only are cars speeding, a lot of parts of the street have sidewalks that are inaccessible to pedestrians and anybody that's using a motor scooter or anything like that. So now they're having to walk in the street or cross the street at, awkward intersections to find a safe passage. And, that's on the city. So the other thing was our city steps. So we have some city steps closer to the bottom near Sawmill Boulevard. There were some broken steps on there. And there are residents who walk from like over on Fairland down those steps to kind of get to the Rite Aid and things like that, rather than walking on 51. So the councilman had advised, after we talked about all of the different things, that one, we have to wait for funding for speed bumps. Two, he didn't think additional signage would make much of a difference. Three, he said that clear the sidewalk across the street shouldn't be a problem, and getting the city steps fixed shouldn't be the problem. He said those were the four things that, yes, no, maybe, yes, yes, yes. I'm like, okay, cool. He says, put everything in an email, send it to, my chief of staff. We're going to get on it. Now, while he and I were standing there talking, and I started showing him all of the pictures from the accidents, and before we went on a little assessment, walk down the street and took a look at some things, he asked me to send the videos and pictures that I had showed him to his staff. He came to my house on August 1st. They got pictures from me every other week. Every time there was a new accident, I was already emailing his staff. So the fact that he got here and didn't know what I was talking about, had never seen the pictures, was asking me for information that was already in the possession of his staff for months prior, it really made me feel like he was really out of touch. So he went on to say that it's really important for him to be involved in the community, be on the pavement, really involved. And that he was sorry that he wasn't able to kind of connect with me sooner, but that all that mattered was that he was here now. And I'm like, no, that's not how this works. Because even when I was on the news in June, talking about a street in your district, and you never once thought to contact me until another council person said, hey, you might want to do something about this. That's a problem, for all of his constituents to, have somebody in a position of power that won't take the necessary steps to at least give some sort of comfort to their constituents who are crying out for support for an issue this big. So we had a conversation. He made comments about why he felt like, because I had explained to him why I didn't appreciate, my experience with him. I said, I've had experiences with council people in other districts. I've never lived in no, I have as a child, but as an adult, I lived in a district. But I've had an issue in other districts. And I made a post about it on Facebook. Somebody got me in touch with that council person. That council person called me immediately. I don't care where you live. You were in my district. What happened? I told them. They got in touch with the people. They gave me every resource that I need, and they did everything that they needed to do on their end to resolve the experience that I had in their district. And I have never lived in that district ever in my life. And so I had explained to him when he was here that this is why it's very hard for me to take what you're saying to me with sincerity. And so, like I said, the end conversation was, that was the problem. And what made me feel super uncomfortable was when I told him about that experience with the other council person. He had made a comment that the only reason why that council person supported me the way that they did was because there are constituents in her district with the same last name as mine who vote for her. And I was like, I don't really understand the correlation. And so I was just like, whatever. So I drafted out the email, sent that to his chief of staff. I made another Facebook post about that comment that he said to me. The other council person saw it. I guess she called him because he called me. Instantly. I didn't answer. I didn't answer on purpose. One thing I noticed about my council person is that he avoids a paper trail about all means necessary. I didn't answer. He sent me a text message. He texted me. He basically said that he meant his comment to me about my family and other districts to be lighthearted, and that he was sorry that I took that from his meeting. And I had to explain to him that he and I don't have a relationship where we can be lighthearted in that way. We can't joke with each other. We are talking about real issues here on Maytide, and you want to make jokes. Before he left here, this was the craziest part. Before he left here, after he said, send the email XYZ, he said, what will really be something? And I was like, what's that? He was like, I got hit while I was standing here today. He said, but I'm not willing to be the sacrifice. And he left. Mind you, 2 months prior to that, I had emailed his staff and said, how much longer do the residents of Maytide have to be the sacrifice for your negligence? So when he came here that day and said that if he got hit, it would be a big deal, but he's not willing to make the sacrifice or be the sacrifice, meaning he knew that if something happened to him here, that would get us some changes or some, enforcement of some sort here. And so that's when I was just like, okay, I see where this is going. So I just kept at it. Like I said, I never spoke to him again after that. I was in constant contact with his staff. Every time there was an accident, I was still doing the same things. I was taking pictures. I was emailing. I was tagging them on Facebook until it got to a point where there were people in other districts and surrounding organizations and things like that reaching out to offer their support. And then I started a petition. I think Miracle, that's what, initiated this. I started that petition. That had got a lot of response. Somebody had put me in touch with somebody from the mayor's office. When I asked them, that contact at the mayor's office, kind of, what do we do? What's going on? They go, oh, no. The funding's here. We found the funding. We got $100,000 for this project. It's coming. Now it's in the hands of the contractor. And I was like, okay, so if you guys have the money and it's in the hands of the contractor, how much longer, or, who holds the contractor accountable? What do we do about how soon they're able to, start this project? Because it was weeks of them saying, hey, we've already done our part. It's up to the contractor to get out and get it done. So my question to them was, who holds the contractors accountable? Do you guys just give them the money and just tell them to do it whenever they feel like it? Why isn't there communication about when this project is going to start? Now, I understand that there were a lot of projects that were delayed because of COVID, and they were trying to catch up, and then they were trying to beat, the change of weather and all of those things. But at the frequency in which we were having these accidents and the severity of them, I pressed the issue that the residents can't afford to go through another winter without some form of traffic calming measure to slow drivers down. Like I said, I made a lot of noise on social media. Finally, it came. So they made an announcement at the very last minute about when they would be coming and what they would be doing. There are a lot of people in the community who think that I decided what they were going to do. You guys know that. I didn't have anything to do with what they decided to do. I just asked them, what can we do? What can be done to kind of, slow people down? So when the final project came out on what they were going to do, even I was disappointed. But I was just like, it's a start, right? So I don't know how familiar you guys are with Maytide and the length of the road, but they had put out a press release the week before they were going to start the project saying that we weren't getting speed bumps, we were getting speed tables, because I guess there's a difference in the dimensions, and that we were only getting 4 of them. And so every resident who, kind of joined in on my efforts and, we're trying to get things done, we're like, well, 4 where? Because the street's so long, it's like, where are you putting them? You know what I mean? That it's going to be effective. And so they told us we were getting 4 speed bumps, we were getting rumble strips, they were adding signage, all of these different things. In the email that I sent to Coke Hill's chief of staff after his visit, I literally had went and looked at a map of my street, all of the intersections, looked up all of the different signs, weight limits, like all this stuff, and basically made suggestions on where we wanted signs placed, why we thought it would be effective for all of these different reasons. And so one of the things that we really wanted were stop signs, because we have a couple cross streets before you get to Brownsville Road that don't have any stop. Now they stop coming on our street, but there's no stop signs to slow motorists down on our street. That wasn't implemented. When they finally did come do the installation, we looked at the placement of the tables. Coming from the bottom up the street, they're so far away from the turn off of Sawmill Run Boulevard that it doesn't really benefit the residents in 8 and 700 and the early 600 block of the street, because they still get to continue speed. It's a far enough distance before they have to slow down to hit the speed bumps. A matter of fact, they closed the street for 2 days to do the work. It was like 8 to 5. The first day that they closed the street, they opened up at 5. There were 2 hit and runs at 6 and 7:30 in the 2 blocks that they didn't put the speed tables. And when me and other residents were reaching out to our council people trying to get, feedback from Dami about why they put them where they did and why there aren't more, they basically said that they had decided that, they weren't necessary in the places that the residents felt that they would be most beneficial. And so a lot of concern from the neighbors has been, why isn't there room for the residents who live on this street and have to pull in and out of their driveways and access this, street every day, a part of the conversation as far as what we think would be, efficient. And I was very clear with them and told them, I'm not an engineer. I do not want to, insult anybody's intelligence or professionalism. But when you've lived here as long as I have and you see the amount of accidents that happen, like I said, at the frequency and the speed that these cars are traveling, I do think that there should be some input accepted from residents on, kind of where we think things should, be to benefit us. Because like I said, since then, it hasn't been much benefit to everybody on the whole road, just because motorists are still, speeding in areas before they approach a speed table.
I thank you so much for coming on, and I do hope that, because I actually drove up a few weeks ago and I was like, these are the tables, and I know exactly what you're talking about, because we had to go to the Walmart to get toys for the children for the Romer Tally giveaway. So we went through that way. But yeah, so I thank you so much for coming on. I do hope that maybe with this, people can get re-energized and you can get some more tables or security measures out there, because that is a very dangerous situation. Now there's going to be ice on that street. I can't imagine with the snow and that weather what's going to happen.
Oh,
so I do
those
thank you
last 2
so much.
snowstorms were crazy. Right. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you. Thank you.
But yeah, but it goes to show, like, people are really out here doing the work, asking politicians to get involved. And this is one of the reasons why, like, we have this show, so we can highlight these stories. But we want to go ahead and get to our last guest, who has been so beyond patient with us. as we have ran out of time, but Kris Henderson is the executive director of the Amistad Law Project. If you've never heard of them, they are a phenomenal legal team out in the Philadelphia area, who predominantly, work for working class people who are incarcerated. They have been doing a lot of work these past couple months around like COVID-19 in jail, and piggybacking off of the program that we had last week, we wanted to bring Kris in. So welcome, Kris, to our program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Just to get right to it, what is really going on with COVID-19 in these jails and prisons?
So in March, at the beginning of the pandemic, the DOC, the Department of Corrections, pretty quickly shut down in-person visits, and effectively put 40,000 people on in solitary confinement. And they were saying that was necessary to keep people safe. And we, along with the ACLU of Pennsylvania, the Abolitionist Law Center, were arguing that really the only way to keep people safe would be to have people leave the prisons, that there were too many people who were in the prisons who were especially vulnerable to COVID-19, that there was no way that people could socially distance. And so we pushed on the governor in a bunch of different ways to try and get him to use his reprieve power to allow people to have their sentences suspended so they could safely quarantine at home with loved ones. And in April, the governor did issue a reprieve order. What actually came of that, though, was that the 12,000 people, and that's according to the Department of Corrections, who are especially vulnerable to COVID-19, this order would have applied to a maximum of 1,800 people, which, the governor made that determination somehow. But basically, the number of people who actually had their sentences reprieved was fewer than 200. And so, they have been able to reduce the Department of Corrections population through a number of other means, mostly through paroling folks who could have been paroled before, who hadn't been. I know a number of folks who were either juvenile lifers or other people who had long sentences who actually now, during this pandemic, were able to come home through parole. But in the spring, there was a sort of wave in the prisons. There were outbreaks in a couple of the prisons. And, we were kind of like, we're still fearful that things could be worse, that things could be a lot worse, because, this pandemic now is still going on. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the last few months is that coming to fruition. People still have not been able to have in-person visits with their loved ones. People still are mostly kept in their cells. People can come out at some prisons for a half hour, an hour. Most of the programming is drastically cut if it exists at all. And still, the thing that would actually allow people to be safer, which is to let folks come home, is not really on the table. And still, they're reducing the cohorts and of how many people can come out at a time, at the same time. People are still not able to see their loved ones, and they're still not able to even go back to the relative, I don't want to say freedom, but the more things that were possible in these institutions before the pandemic. So I don't know if I
Yeah, and I saw on your social media that on your social media that there's been an issue with the dashboard. Can you talk a little bit about that and why it's so important to get accurate numbers of who is and isn't getting documented as having COVID or COVID exposure in the prisons?
So the prisons sort of operate fairly independently from one another, and also like with some oversight from the Department of Corrections, but it's really variable what that actually looks like. So there are a number of things that are supposed to be happening in all the prisons, according to the Department of Corrections, and like we're mostly talking to those like sort of head folks in the DOC, who are like, yeah, everybody's supposed to wear masks. These are the protocols. But then when we talk to people who are incarcerated, who are actually like dealing with prison staff and corrections officers on a daily basis, they're like, no, people aren't wearing their masks. Like, no, we're getting our food and it's cold. When I'm going to get my medication, there's a ton of people there who are all too close to one another. And so I think a big thing is that the way, like, because we can't go inside, because it's like really not safe for us to go inside, although we could as lawyers and legal workers, we don't, like, we have limited access to the information that we're getting from incarcerated people. And so this information that we're supposed to be getting from the dashboard, as far as like who's being tested and why and what the positivity rates are, one, it's like the way that the Department of Corrections displays that data is not particularly intuitive. It's not the way that we see it in most of the COVID-19 trackers on the outside, which is part of the reason that we worked with some data scientists to create a COVID tracker that's specifically for folks who are incarcerated, to sort of translate that DOC data into the way that people are more familiar with seeing it. At the same time, though, the DOC, I think they don't want to be particularly transparent. Even being able to put up that tracker that we worked with data scientists to do, we were asking for different data. We're asking for like basically a direct line to the data that they were like accumulating or like creating, or like the direct like sort of results from the various COVID-19 tests. And they basically said, no, you have to look at our tracker online the same way everyone else does, which made it more difficult to actually be able to translate that data for folks. And also we've seen that there is a lag with that data that they put up, where like especially over the weekends, I guess that they are not like updating it, even though they're getting results from folks. They're knowing, they know whether people are positive, whether people are passing away, but there's a lag in them actually releasing that information.
Yeah, and then we know there was a story that was just a couple weeks ago, that there was an individual who unfortunately passed away and the family was not even notified. And so I think people don't understand, like, fighting for this information is like so important, because people are literally don't even know about the health and safety of their loved ones. And you've been pushing, and we're about to share some of the editorials. And so what is some of the responses that you have seen, and can you talk a little bit about this upcoming hearing on Thursday and why people should be like sharing their stories and getting involved?
I spoke to someone who's incarcerated, who told me that there's, like we know, there's no way to socially distance in prison, and what actually ends up happening is that people are just punished, and that's the only way that they can sort of create some semblance of social distance. I think the thing that we're seeing with this hearing on Thursday is that the Department of Corrections has made lots of assurances that they're able to keep people safe, that they're able to keep these people in their care safe. What we've seen is that that's actually not true. Because people are not able to get visits from loved ones, we know that the only way that COVID-19 could be getting into the prisons is through staff and vendors. that it's not, magically permeating through these concrete walls. And so it's like there are things that they need to be doing, and ways they need to be sort of managing their staff to make sure that this population of 40,000 people are safe. And so I think that, senators really want to ask the DOC, you said that you could do this, you obviously can't, what's going on? And, I think that we hope that the Department of Corrections will concede that they actually can't keep people safe. And maybe, we'll be able to put more pressure on the governor. He can use his reprieve power to actually release folks. And I think maybe you had another question in there.
Yes, and then so I know there's a hearing on Thursday that the Pennsylvania caucus is putting up, talking about COVID-19 in the jails. I know you're encouraging people to sign up and to share their stories, but why is it so important that these elected officials understand what's happening in these prisons?
I think that at various points in the pandemic, people have. It's easy to sort of ignore people in prison, to act like that what's happening in prisons doesn't affect the rest of us. And I think, obviously for people who have loved ones inside, that's very much not the case. But even people who don't, there's still a really direct correlation to these spikes and outbreaks that have happened in the prisons and our healthcare infrastructure being taxed. And if there are a number of people who are incarcerated who have to go to prison, to hospitals, to be on ventilators, to get additional medical support, that affects the entire community around where they're imprisoned, because folks are then going to have less capacity for the healthcare infrastructure as a whole. I think also that anybody who lives in Pennsylvania has a responsibility to care about and to make sure that the people who are imprisoned by our state are actually being taken care of humanely. And when people are incarcerated and cannot be kept safe during a pandemic, that's something that we should all be concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, given its limited data still, like you said, but given the data that we have, indicating that COVID cases are spiking a lot in the prisons in Pennsylvania in the last couple months, do you see this applying any added pressure to Governor Wolf and all the other relevant parties in finally granting some more of these reprieves to even get close to that 1,800 number that Governor Wolf originally put out? Or if not, what do you see as being the main roadblocks that really have caused such an under granting of reprieves? We're still, as far as I'm aware, still substantially short of that 1,800 number, which again was a lot less than the original recommended by the DOC as well.
I mean, I think one of the things is that Pennsylvania has over 5,000 people who are serving life without parole or death by incarceration. Everybody who's serving death by incarceration is imprisoned for being convicted of a violent offense, homicide. And all of these people were not exempted from this reprieve order. And we know that many of the people who are especially vulnerable to COVID-19 are people who are older, who are elderly, people with other health conditions. And most of those folks are people who have been in prison for a long time, many of them who at this point are sentenced to die in prison. And so until elected officials are actually looking at this like a human rights crisis and looking at this as something that's yes, we can check these boxes, but we can never allow people with violent offenses to have a second chance, to have any sort of redemption, to be able to come home, to be able through any means, then we're going to be in this same position because the reason that number, that 1,800 number was so low is because, people with violent offenses were immediately taken off the table. And we know that many of the people who were in prison, when we really look at the numbers, are people who were there for violent offenses. But that's not to say that most of them couldn't come home tomorrow and actually be able to not hurt other people and to contribute meaningfully to their communities.
A word. And so, again, thank you so much for your patience and everything that's happening. What are some of the actions that people need to be taking to, encourage the governor to get these higher numbers of people released home, to encourage the board of pardons and parole to get to allow more people, that make the application process, more streamlined? What are some of the things that, activists, organizers, people who are just new to this issue can do to get involved?
Thank you for having me. And I think there's both like a sort of short term and a longer term thing. On the shorter term, people can watch this in a hearing online. They can follow us on social media and sort of hear about what's going on. People can call the governor and ask that he grant more reprieves, and also reach out to the Board of Pardons to ask them to grant more commutations, especially to people who are serving life without parole. And also the governor can actually sign the commutations that have been granted, that are currently waiting for his signature. There are, a number of folks who have been who've had their sentences commuted but are still incarcerated because he hasn't signed their commutations yet. But I think on the sort of longer term, what we really want to emphasize is that the reason that the prisons cannot keep people safe during a pandemic is because they can't keep people safe at all. And that, what we're seeing now is not something that's new, but really just like at best, or like at worst, something that has like exacerbated the conditions that already existed. We've been seeing people who were not getting adequate medical care, who, didn't have enough access to loved ones, who really were being punished in many different ways for things that, happened decades ago, things that like effectively were done by someone else, because like so much time had passed that they just really were not the same people. And so, I think in this moment, we're able to really highlight this issue in a more, like a really sort of direct way. But it's something that's going to keep happening even after everyone in prison gets vaccinated or has access to the vaccine, even after this pandemic is over. There's still going to be people in prison who should not be, and people who have no mechanism to actually get out.
All right. Well, I do thank you so much for all your tireless, efforts this past summer, fighting for organizers and protesters who've been wrongly incarcerated, helping just like do a lot of mutual aid and galvanizing folks, all while also, fighting to abolish death by incarceration. You're welcome back on our program anytime. And again, thank you so much for your patience this evening.
Thank you for having me. It was really great.
Thank you so much. Great to have you on.
All right. So our first show of the year, right? Yeah. it's already 2021. Yeah. So we're very excited. Just to round out again, we thank you all so much for your support of the One Hit Power Hour. We have a lot of great things planning and great things coming up. So please stay tuned. Just do our quick rundown.
Yep. Got right back to it. 1 week off and right back to it.
Right back to it. So if you are registered to vote in Georgia, please make sure you get out to vote for the Senate race tomorrow. The polls are from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. They close when the last person in line has voted. So please make sure that you are registered to vote and voting.
Tomorrow on What Black Pittsburgh Needs to Know, we have a very special edition of the program. We're going to be joined by the family of Oscar Grant to talk about how there is some new developments in the case and their fight for justice, and how they have a petition and a possible new prosecution against other officers involved in the shooting of Oscar Grant, who was killed in 2009 by police at the BART station. On Wednesday, we're Black with This Week in White Supremacy. And so also you do have, like Jay-luh said, the moratorium that they're trying to fight to have it extended. There are different avenues for you to use. Please make sure you're using that paperwork and fighting, because that stuff can be rescinded. But please, please, please reach out if you need rental help and support, because it is there and available for you. Lastly, you have until I believe the 15th of January to apply for health insurance. So if you do not have health insurance, Pennsylvania has their own marketplace. So please make sure you can go online and register, and we'll have some program in the next couple of weeks about that. And so we're very excited. Please tune in next week. We'll have Congressman Mike Doyle, who will be joining us to talk about some really interesting develops for media ownership that is coming in the next 10 years with some new legislation. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I won't drag this out any longer. It seems like we're back to our old ways of going well over time as anticipated. But yeah, another great episode. Thank you to all of our guests this week. Thank you to Miracle for that rundown at the end. Nice job controlling T'Challa while going through all of that. I saw him making his appearances on screen. But yeah, we'll be back next week with Congressman Mike Doyle. So yeah, thank y'all for tuning in, and see you next week.
All right.